Oh man.
Yeah, but I mean, realistically,
I'm
there are only two types of players in Summoners War: the people who
that is
scroll on
true.
their island to get to arena, and people who click battle and go to arena.
Yeah, yeah. That's so true.
Yo, what's going on, guys? Welcome back. Bringing you a new kind of video here today. Thought I'd do a little collaboration with somebody that's not Sean B. So we have Lucky Madman here, my old guild leader in SW Chill main, now has moved to Malicious. Congratulations again, guys. Season 8 Legends in Siege is absolutely amazing. What's going on? How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Doing well. Really excited to do the series with you. I think it's going to be very knowledgeable to a lot of people out there. It would give people a nice new perspective on, I guess, how we look at certain things in the game. So I'm looking forward to doing this with you. Thank you for bringing me on board with this.
And thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us. Also, if you guys don't know, we will be at the LA meetup. So if you haven't had a chance to get your tickets for that and you are in town, you should come by and visit, say hi to us, meet us, see what's going on. But without further ado, let's get right to it. Today, guys, we are going to be talking about reappraisal stones, how to use them, why we use them, a little couple of tips and tricks on what we should and shouldn't reapp and why. The first point that I think we should talk about is what are the absolute don'ts when it comes to reapps. A lot of people will talk about, oh, you know what makes a reapp good? How do we use reapps? The first thing and the easiest way to narrow it down, I think, is to talk about what we absolutely don't do and why we don't do it.
Yeah, so I think you've mentioned something really important there. One of the main things that you don't want to do is reapp something that is not a legendary 6-star rune. So one of the things you want to do is make sure that you want to make sure that you're only reapping legendary 6-star runes. So, some people can accidentally make the mistake of actually trying to reapp a purple rune.
So that overall value is absolutely amazing. Look at this, fam. Again, this is not the perfect rune, but 2 reapps into it, we get a plus 16 rune. We graded we get a 20 speed attack rune. Not the greatest for where I'm at right now, but that's still going to be improvement for somebody, right? For somebody. Oh dear. Oh dear. Oh dear. This is a hero rune, but I mean, it's a oh no.
If you guys don't know my boy Childish, I fucking love this man. Check him out right here.
Stay away from those. Stay clear. Or a legendary 5-star rune. So our main focus when we're using reapps should always be looking at our 6-star legendary runes as default grade.
Yeah, most definitely. So you can definitely run into the trap of that, especially if you don't know exactly what makes something a legendary 6-star rune. But gladly, the reappraisal tool, when we go to that page, does tell you what the starting grade of the rune is. The main reason we don't want to go into those things and we don't want to do non-6-star runes, non-legendary runes is when you reapp them, the amount of total stat you can get from the reapp is entirely 1 roll less than you would get with a legendary 6-star rune.
Yeah, that's correct. So it limits it based on the grade of the rune. So in the case of a hero rune, there are 7 total rolls available compared to a legend, which will have 8 total rolls available when it does the whole reappraisal process. So that's why you kind of want to make sure you're only really looking at those legend quality runes.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of you guys will think, oh, wait, 8 rolls. What does that mean? What we're talking about is the starting roll plus all of the upgrade rolls. The next one that we want to talk about is probably going to be stats that you want on the rune and what to avoid in certain situations.
So we've got an example on screen here, which is showing a defense percent innate on a slot 5 legendary rune. Using this rune as an example, or using this slot as an example, slot 5 is one of those areas where you can roll every percentage or almost every single stat except for flat HP. So it's one of those areas where you can really stat chase every important stat that there is to be able to get on a unit. You can get your HP percent, your defense percent, your attack, and your speed as your main stats. And so it allows you the ability to use one of those other missing stats as to kind of round out the rune. So something like a crit rate or anything that's below the line on a unit, essentially. So when I talk about below the line, I'm talking about crit rate, crit damage, resistance, or accuracy as the innate. But you kind of want all those top level stats, the HP, attack, defense, and speed on the main aspect of the rune. So losing defense percent here means it's a stat that you can no longer get as a substat, and therefore you cannot grow the value of that defense percent.
Yeah, so to extend on that, the reason that that's so valuable is because if it's an innate stat, you can't grind it, which means you're losing out on that plus 10% that plus 10% potential from a max grind.
Exactly right. It doesn't mean that you can't. It doesn't mean that you have to necessarily always looking for quad grindables. There are valuable runes that you could still get on slot 5 that doesn't necessarily have all 4 grindable stats as a substat. So that's just something as a bit of an offset point there.
Hmm. And then the last talking point when it comes to the absolute don'ts for reapps would be what we consider non-main sets. Now, non-main sets are going to be sets that generally we wouldn't want to use reapps for because either we don't use that many of the set, it's not as relevant for certain pieces of content like RTA, Guild Wars, Siege, Arena, or sometimes it's just not a popular set or it's too hard to use.
Yeah, so because with the I guess the environment now with farming and B12 dungeons, for example, there is always an abundant supply of legendary runes. And therefore, you're going to end up with a lot of targets if you considered every single legend rune with an innate as a target. And so, therefore, it's always good to kind of narrow that down because if we consider everything as a target, we're probably going to get nowhere with our account development. So, when we're also looking at main stats, there is, you know, I believe that probably 85% of your runes that you're looking for will be one of those core sets that you're looking for, which is usually around despair, violent, swift, combined with an offset like will in most cases. So that's kind of those areas that you want to try and build a solid base on, considering most of your units are going to be built on those sort of rune sets. It's not saying that offsets are bad, but you can end up with an abundance of offsets just from farming, and you probably, I personally would not recommend ever reapping a specific offset. That's not really too value add.
Yeah, there are specific exceptions in some cases. So, for example, if you're like us, you're a really high tier Siege player, you might want to reapp things like Destroy runes or Revenge runes because you're looking for very specific builds. It's okay to do things like that, but in this video, we're talking about a more general overview for people that, one, generally don't buy reapps, so you're going to be earning a lot of them from events as well as the free ones you can craft every week, as well as looking at just a more basic way on what you should be using for the overall betterment of your account.
Yeah, most definitely. I think there was one more point that we wanted to talk about. One of the last talking points was actually looking at non-innates as a potential target as well. So in most cases, our recommendation would be try and find a rune with a suitable innate, because what an innate does is it actually takes away the ability to roll that substat, and it starts limiting the number of options there are for a specific stat to show up as a substat. Then, for example, crit damage can have effectively all the options on a unit. So if you look at it, there's 8 options. Take away crit damage, you can have up to 7 different stats that show up here, plus the flat stats. So that gets you up to another 3. So you can have up to 10 options there as a substat. So having something in an innate immediately removes it and goes from 1 in 10 to 1 in 9 of a substat showing. So it kind of limits what sort of substats you can actually roll on a unit as well.
Yeah, the
Something
reason
to
this is so
consider.
valuable is if you're looking for a really high roll in a specific stat, it just gives you a better overall chance. So if you're a speed chaser, for example, you're trying to find that 30 speed rune that everyone wants, having the innate stat will make it statistically easier to get speed on your rune and to get that 30 speed roll. All right, so now that we've covered all of the absolute don'ts, the next thing that we should talk about here is what makes a good reapp target. Now, I want to disclaim before we get into it that this is going to be for generalized account progression, right? I know we're using my account as an example. I am a fairly endgame player. I've done G3 Siege, G2 RTA for a long time, but the information we're talking about can be applied to any level of account, and that's really important that you guys remember that. So the first thing that I want to go over is going to be talking about main sets. So I know we just brought this up recently with the other section, but it's really, really, really important to do main sets, guys, first. These are going to be the things that boost your account the most because these are the rune sets you're using the most. So after that, I think that we should go into the values of slot 1 and 3 versus the value of slot 5.
Okay, so the main value you get out of slot 1 and 3 compared to slot 5 is the ability to be able to get certain stats a bit more easily in your 1 and 3 compared to slot 5. The main reason behind that is the amount of available substats there are in slot 1 and slot 3 compared to the other slots. What I'm trying to say here is with slot 1 and slot 3, as you guys are probably already aware, you cannot get certain substats. In slot 1, you cannot get defense percent or flat defense as a substat, but in slot as well as in slot 3, you cannot get attack percent or flat attack as a substat. compared to every other slot where you can actually get those substats or those stats as a substat. So what that does is in slot 1 and 3, there is only up to a potential number. There's up to a potential of 8 stats that you can get as a substat. You can limit that down to just 7 if you have an innate target in there as well. Compared to all the other stats or all the other slots where you can actually get up to 10 of the 11 options, which you can limit down to 9. So therefore, if you look at it, there are 7 available substats available in 1 and 3, compared to 9 in all the other slots.
So we talked about the value of each slot, how it's easier to get certain substat combinations on 1 and 3 due to having less substat potential. But let's talk about innates. So first of all, innates are the substat directly beneath a rune. It's what gives the rune a prefix. So if you see this rune, for example, it's called an intricate violent rune, which means it has an innate substat of accuracy percentage. Now, this is specifically what we're looking for when we look at Reapp targets. We want runes that have innates because it lowers the amount of available substats in the rune, making it easier to Reapp. Now, different slots have different values for innates. We're going to be looking for different types of innates on different slots. But before we get into that, I want to talk about what we think are the best general innates and the innates we absolutely don't want.
Yeah, so going through each slot, we'll just go around the wheel. Effectively, we can treat almost slot 1 and 3 similarly, but every other slot you can treat slightly differently, depending on the way depending on the way you may perceive things. So for slot 1 and 3, the strongest innates in my perspective, or at least from my experiences, are around accuracy. And the reason for accuracy being relatively strong is because a lot of the units that you use have some sort of effect available to their attacks, right? And it's one of those values that it's one of those stats that you kind of want to build on a unit without kind of committing to it from a substat perspective. So getting it in the prefix is a lot easier to be able to build up what you need. A lot of units only need around 40% to deal with units that have no resistance, without going into too much detail. So therefore, getting it from prefix is a higher value than it is actually trying to get it from a substat perspective, because you can now chase other stats that you want to mainly focus on your units in those substat regions. So that's where I would say accuracy would be one of the higher values. After accuracy, looking at slot 1 and slot 3, my next value at the moment, I'm thinking it's around either a flat stat, something that I don't want to really roll in a unit, or around resistance or crit damage. Now, the reason why I say those stats rather than the obvious one that I'm missing, which is around crit rate, is because in slot 1 and 3, considering how limited your options are for rolling a certain stat, I still value crit rate relatively high on units, and therefore I would like to have the ability of rolling crit rate as a substat on a rune, and getting it from a limited source, being slot 1 and 3, where you can only get, there's only 7 options. Crit rate, to me, I consider still a very high and valued target for me on some of my runes that I like to roll, or at least to be able to build a base to be able to get my units to that 80 to 85 crit rate target that I want to build on my units. And getting a lot of those crit rate subs from my slot 1 and my slot 3, as well as coupled with slot 2. If I can get all my crit rate there, it makes it easier on the other slots.
Yeah, so the next part to kind of go into that, the reason that we are looking for either the accuracy or the crit rate as a potential role on these is a lot of the times you're going to hear players talk about something called efficiency. We'll go over this a little bit later, but the rough kind of discussion point I want to bring up with it is that on a slot 1 and a slot 3, if you get speed and the 2 percentage stats that you can grind, which is going to be on slot 1 speed, HP, and attack percentage, and on slot 3 that'll be speed, HP, and defense percentage, your last slot available can either be a grindable flat HP or it could be a crit rate that you might want to roll into instead. When it comes to slot 2s, we know that on slot 2s is the only rune that you can have a speed main stat. So that's generally going to be the rune that we're looking to reapp. However, in some cases, you may be interested in reapping attack percent, defense percent, or HP percent. We can talk about those later. Let's get into a speed slot 2 first because it's the most common one and it's going to be the most relevant for most players.
So in regards to speed slot 2, the main, or what would be considered a good reapp target here would be something that you don't actually want to hit as a substat on a rune. So whatever you want to try and avoid getting as a substat, get that as a prefix if possible. So our example here that we have on screen on the left side is effectively looking at a flat HP substat, and that's because, sorry, a prefix, and that's because we are looking to avoid rolling that as one of our substats when we reappraise the rune. The reason for that is in your slot 2, without going into too much detail, we'll talk about this in a later part of the series, is slot 2 is where you're trying to chase specific stats. You're trying to get like high crit rate or high accuracy, and therefore, you want to try and couple that with your 3 grindables being your HP percent, your defense percent, and your attack percent. So getting that third substat, as Tyler's mentioned before, for slot 1 and 3, you can chase your crit rate and your accuracy here as your fourth slot, which is not your grindable slot. So trying to avoid that prefix of flat, or trying to avoid that flat HP could make this rune a very high value, because you can now be able to chase both those substats being crit rate or accuracy.
Now, this doesn't mean that an accuracy or crit rate innate is bad necessarily, but it's a more it's a much more detailed explanation on what we would be looking for in those runes. So we won't be talking about it in this video, and instead we'll be talking about it in the next one. Additionally to the way we're approaching speed slot 2, where we're looking for an innate stat that isn't something we want to roll as a substat on the rune, we can also treat slot 4 and slot 6 HP percent, defense percent, and attack percent runes the same way. Now that we've talked about the HP percent, defense percent, and attack percent slot 4 and slot 6, the next thing that we should talk about here is crit rate main slot 4 and crit damage main slot 4. But also, it's worth talking about slot 5s at this time, because they kind of interact and work the same way when we talk about reappraisal stone approaches.
Yeah, so the main points that Tyler's raised here is that around slot 4 and slot 5, compared to every other slot to a certain extent, bar slot 6, right? Slot 4 and slot 5 are your places if you have crit damage or crit rate as a main stat, stat for your slot 4. As well as slot 5, what you can end up getting is you can end up getting 4 grindable substats. Your main 4 grindable substats. What we mean by that is your HP percent, your attack percent, your defense, and your speed. You can get them all as a substat on a rune to really beef up what I consider the top half of your stats on your unit. So it is the only place to really be able to achieve that, unless you're really looking at slot 6 accuracy or resistance. But for the purpose of this section of the video, we're going to just narrow it down to slot 4 and slot 5. So what are you trying to look for as a substat on your rune then? Anything that really works well for your unit. So on a lot of the times on a crit damage slot 4, ideally you're looking at a crit rate innate, so you can get the 4 grindables below it. Otherwise, you can take accuracy because the harmful effect chances. And then outside of that, you could probably take a flat stat or even resistance. For slot 5, again, crit rate's probably the most valuable one, followed by accuracy, and then anything else can kind of work if you have enough Reapp targets Reapps to be able to use on those targets.
Yeah, most definitely. Another thing when we're looking at innates in this sense is specifically with the crit damage and the crit rate slot 4s, I do value resistance to be a lower substat, since generally on those units that you're using, crit build, crit damage build, you're not building them high resist anyways. So it becomes a little bit less efficient than, let's say, a flat stat that just gives you more raw stats or getting that accuracy or crit rate innate.
Definitely worth all looking at. So, getting a substat like attack could be very useful here for a damage dealer when it's a crit damage main. And on slot 5, it could be a bit more of a rounded stat that you're looking for.
Last 2 runes that we haven't talked about yet are your slot 6 accuracy and your slot 6 resist. Now, these ones we left to last because they're a little bit more unique in how you would want to reapp for them and if you would want to reapp for them.
Yeah, so let's start with accuracy first. Accuracy has kind of become a lot more prevalent due to RTA and the ability to, make the most of the whole ACRES system in Summon as well. One of the main aspects with accuracy that we've seen of late is around the fact that, the main thing that we're trying to get on these sort of runes is speed. And that's to kind of take turn 1 and do what you need to with your control units or your stripping units, for example. When it comes to Reapp targets or trying to determine your best Reapp targets for an accuracy slot 6 rune, you're effectively looking for anything that you don't really want as a substat. So effectively, it's a similar concept to applying to your slot 2 to a certain extent. you kind of want those grindable stats. As mentioned earlier on, slot 4 and 5 can have 4 grindables. Slot 6 could also have 4 grindables if it's accuracy and res. So your ideal situation, you're trying to get to all 4 grindables with a decent sort of speed target, but it's not the end of the world if you don't get that speed. There are other units, especially in the siege side of the game, that you can still use accuracy slot 6s.
So you mentioned about how accuracy is. When it comes to resistance runes for slot 6, this is one of those ones where, yes, you want 4 grindables. You'd like to have your speed, your HP attack, and defense percentages. However, you can also utilize other substats like that really effectively, like flat HP or flat defense. Getting more raw, bulky stats on a lot of your resistance slot 6 units is going to be more beneficial. Generally, these are your really tanky cleansers, your healers, just things that need to survive, right? So when we're looking at those runes, we're going to be looking generally for something like either an accuracy percent innate, or maybe a flat attack innate, but we can very well use the flat HP and flat defense innates should we wish to have attack percent on the rune. So I know that we mentioned that accuracy and resist were kind of the last 2 we wanted to cover, but in truth, the last 2 that we want to cover that most people don't talk about would be attack slot 2 and HP defense slot 2s. Now, these aren't talked about as much because generally in RTA, you're mainly focused on using speed slot 2 units. However, you can use the attack, HP, and defense percentage ones there. Generally, they're not as common, so most people won't re-app them because you'll naturally get decent runes of those types as you farm. However, if you're like Lucky or I, and you're a siege main, that HP percent slot 2 might be very valuable. So do you want to talk about what kind of innates you'd be looking for on an HP slot 2?
Yeah, that's fine. So the main sort of substats that or prefixes that I'd be looking for in slot 2 would be similarly to what I'd be looking for in a 4 and 6 attack or HP percent rune. I'd be looking mainly for crit rate innate or accuracy innate, something that's going to kind of boost what I'm looking for on my units. And the main stat I'm going to be looking for on slot 2 is kind of that missing speed. Look, not every rune needs speed on slot 2 as a substat, because there are units that you can utilize. For example, in the siege field or even in RTA, if you're using a Leo-based comp, for example, speed becomes irrelevant. So the main thing I'm looking for is trying to, similar to what we mentioned earlier on, is essentially a stat we don't really want to hit as a substat. So I wouldn't mind having crit rate or accuracy as one of the main prefixes. Otherwise, if I had plenty of targets and plenty of reapps available, the next sort of target for me would be a flat stat outside of that. Or even res, actually. Res would be probably higher than a flat stat.
So we've talked about what makes a good reapp target. Now, there are a couple unique exceptions that I want to talk about, and I think Lucky will agree with me on these ones. The main exception being speed slot 2. So speed slot 2 runes, I am willing to reapp sometimes without innates, simply because you need so many of them. Now, on these runes, and I know I'm getting a little bit into the results aspect of this, but you don't want to greed on them. You just want something good and something usable and then move on, right? That boost to your account might be significant enough for you to warrant using reapps on something without an innate stat. The other one that I've considered as well would be crit damage slot 4 and HP attack percent slot 6. However, those ones I would only really consider doing if I had an abundance of reapps and I really needed the account progression. So I hope you guys liked this video. We did a really high level overview here of what makes a rune a good reapp target, kind of how reapps work and how we approach it. So if you like this video, please leave a comment below. Let us know what you thought about it. And as well, in our next video, we're going to be doing something a little bit different. I have bought some reapps for my account, and we're going to go over account-specific targets using a method that Lucky has developed that's actually pretty effective. And I'm really looking forward to having that opportunity for my account to be viewed from that perspective.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to showing you guys the method that I use to be able to consider what I consider reapp targets to be, and effectively what would improve my account to that next level. So I'm looking forward to showing you my approach, going through with OnceInLuv in terms of trying to show where his account can improve. If there's anything you guys would like us to elaborate in a bit more detail from this video, feel free to leave it in the comments section below. We'll go into it in a bit more detail if required in the next segment.
Yeah, so thank you so much for everything, Lucky. I really appreciate having you here, and I look forward to recording the next one. Do you have anything you want to say to the viewers or any last remarks?
Look, I think this is going to be a bit of a blast. I think hopefully you guys get a lot out of this. It's a good way to kind of point out your account shortfalls and the areas that you can kind of work on when it comes to your rune depth or your rune quality. So I hope you guys get something out of this. And if you guys do like this video, make sure you do like and subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you, everyone.
Awesome. And again, we will be at LA meetup. So if you guys are in LA, you have a chance to come down to Tom's Watch Bar. I'll put the link in the description below and you can come check it out.